Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a kingdom just caught in centuries of, well, constant upheaval. We're talking civil war, powerful nobles switching sides, yeah, often based on personal grudges. And these dramatic events, they weren't just exciting stories. They fundamentally reshaped England's future. We've been digging into a stack of really fascinating source materials covering this whole period, roughly early 13th to late 15th century. These sources, accounts, chronicles, old records, they give us a direct window into the lives of kings, queens, the people pulling strings behind the scenes, even glimpses of ordinary life, all during this age of immense change and, frankly, often brutal conflict. So our mission in this deep dive is to guide you through these sources, pull out the really important bits, the key nuggets, and help you see how the key figures, these endless conflicts, the big transformations, how they laid the groundwork, often quite rocky groundwork, mind you, for England's constitution, its sense of national identity. It's all here, really, in the material. So settle in. We're about to take a deep dive into centuries of struggle, survival, and some really unexpected twists.
It's an absolutely packed period, and the sources really highlight just how unstable things were right from the start, really, after King John.
Okay, so where does that take us first?
We kick off with Henry III, early 13th century. The crown's pretty weak, and the power, well, it lies very much with the barons. The sources mention key actions like Pembroke investing Mount Sorel and then the siege of Lincoln Castle.
Right, and the Battle of Lincoln itself.
Yeah.
The source description makes it sound almost, I don't know, polite? Is that the right word?
It is striking. The source notes how few people were actually killed, but loads of important figures were captured. It specifically says about 400 knights. And the commentary that follows is really revealing. It calls those ancient barons and their men wretched soldiers, completely unacquainted with everything but arms.
So, not exactly military geniuses, despite their political clout.
That's the implication, yeah. Lots of political muscle, maybe not so much tactical skill, according to this account.
And that political muscle meant constant tension over things like Magna Carta, for instance. This exchange from the source is brilliant. Henry III griping, "Why should I observe this charter, which is neglected by all my grandees?" And the comeback is just blunt. "You ought, sir, to set them the example."
Exactly. It perfectly captures the hypocrisy, doesn't it? And the sort of breakdown of law. The king wants obedience, but won't give it himself because, well, the nobles aren't either.
Right. A vicious cycle.
And the power struggles weren't just with the barons. You had intense influence from ministers, often churchmen, actually, like Peter de Roche, the Bishop of Winchester. The church itself, figures like Edmund the Primate, they were major political players challenging these ministers all the time.
And the Pope was always hovering in the background, wasn't he? Demanding money, influence.
Oh, constantly. The source talks about demands like the Pope wanting the two best prebends. Think of those as like valuable church jobs with income from every cathedral, and 2 monks' portions from every single convent. That's a huge potential revenue stream.
Wow. And did they just roll over and pay?
No, the sources say it was unanimously rejected. And the reasoning given was quite pragmatic, actually. They argued the revenue would be permanent, sure, but the abuses the money was supposedly meant to fix, they'd just continue anyway. They weren't buying it.
Cynical, but maybe realistic.
Yeah.
And the sheer amount of money leaving England for Rome was a big issue.
A massive drain. The source mentions some authors claiming this huge figure, 700,000 marks, left England. Though it wisely adds that's probably much exaggerated. Still, it also quotes Pope Innocent's own bull asking for 50,000 marks a year.
Even that lower figure is substantial.
Absolutely. A significant chunk of wealth heading out of the kingdom every year.
Which must have fed into Henry III's money troubles and his reliance on foreign supporters.
Precisely. He spent lavishly, often on these foreigners, and struggling to assert authority because the barons themselves were ignoring the Great Charter with their own vassals, their tenants. So he felt, why should I uphold it rigorously? This whole period is defined by that constant push and pull. Who really holds power? Who has to obey the law?
Okay, so moving on, we get Edward I, often called the English Justinian, right? For his legal reforms.
Yeah, he definitely had that reputation. The sources credit him with improving loads of laws, statutes covering really important areas of legal life.
But here's where it gets really juicy. The source immediately flips, describing his later, much more arbitrary actions. It mentions a captious clause in a charter confirmation, him getting papal permission to break oaths he'd sworn, and levying talliages at discretion, basically just imposing taxes whenever he felt like it, even after promising not to.
Uh-huh.
So how do you square that? The great lawgiver acting like the law doesn't apply to him.
Well, it shows the reality of power back then, doesn't it? Even a king focused on lawmaking might just ditch the rules when it suited him, often driven by money or politics. The sources also talk about judicial corruption under his reign. They say the fountains of justice were poisoned. Grim phrase.
Yep.
There's this anecdote about the Chamberlain, a top official, caught red-handed. He was hanged but refused to name accomplices. Suggests the rot was widespread. Accounts also mention just general robbery and violence being pretty rampant at the time.
That kind of internal instability would definitely fuel conflicts elsewhere. Scotland, for instance.
Absolutely. The sources give a good rundown of the Scottish succession crisis. The core issue was between two main claims: Balliol's through the elder family line, so representation, versus Bruce's based on propinquity, basically being one generation closer to the common ancestor. The Scottish nobles, the people, they were split. Sides were taken.
And Edward stepped in to mediate.
He got involved, yes,
Yeah.
and ruled in favor of Balliol. And then the source says Balliol made this irrevocable resignation of the crown to Edward, effectively handing Scotland over.
Which naturally didn't sit well with everyone. Cue figures like William Wallace.
Exactly. Wallace emerges fighting this English takeover. He wasn't alone, though. He had support from some Scottish barons like Sir William Douglas, and even initially secret backing from Robert Bruce. Wallace became regent, acting in Balliol's name. The sources mention Scottish tactics like schiltrons, those dense spear formations, and palisades, defensive stakes.
And the famous Battle of Falkirk. How did the sources describe that?
As a major English victory, they really stressed the effectiveness of the English archers. They were becoming a serious weapon. It even quotes Wallace, supposedly, acknowledging Edward's military skill, saying the English had learned from him the art of war. Ouch.
Yeah. Despite the defeat, though, Wallace kept going.
His perseverance is noted, yeah. He didn't just give up.
But ultimately,
He was betrayed, captured, and executed in 1305. The sources suggest Edward felt his grip on Scotland was just insecure as long as Wallace was out there, fueled his determination to get him.
right. And after Wallace, Robert Bruce steps up properly.
He does. The sources say Bruce acted against a Cummin, another Scottish noble, who was apparently treacherous, making deals with the king. Bruce was apprised of his treachery. Then Bruce gets himself crowned at Scone. The English, apart from holding some fortresses, were basically chased out again.
So Edward has to react.
Sends forces under Aymer de Valence. But it does raise that question, doesn't it? Despite Edward's power, how did Scottish resistance keep bouncing back?
Yeah, why wasn't it crushed?
Well, the sources hint at a few things. Scotland's difficult terrain, probably. The sheer determination of leaders like Wallace and Bruce. And maybe Edward's resources being stretched thin. He had other conflicts brewing, like with France.
Yes, France. The sources mention that briefly under Edward I too.
Yeah, just skirmishes mostly. The French took and burned Dover at one point, and they allied with Balliol, trying to force Edward to fight on two fronts, draw forces away from Scotland.
And while all this is happening, Parliament is starting to take shape back in England.
This is absolutely crucial. The sources note barons being summoned by writ, basically a royal letter, rather than just because they held land. And the creation of titular earls suggests nobility is becoming more about royal favor, less purely feudal power. Plus, the decline of the old feudal armies lessened the barons' direct military dependence on the king. Things are shifting.
And the big one, the emergence of the House of Commons?
Yes. The summoning of 2 knights from each shire and deputies from the boroughs in 1295, that's generally seen as the key moment. The birth certificate, if you like.
But it wasn't quite as formal as we imagine.
No, and this detail from the sources is great. Apparently, sheriffs sometimes just skipped summoning boroughs if they couldn't find suitable people, and they were thanked for it.
Really?
Yeah, shows how practical, maybe even a bit haphazard the beginnings were, not some perfectly designed system from day one.
And Parliament's growing power was often tied to the king needing cash.
Absolutely, that's a constant theme. The clergy often got taxed directly by the Pope, and the king sometimes managed to get a slice of that. Edward I hit the clergy with a massive tax, half their revenues at one point. But the source notes he found it more prudent to actually assemble their leaders, the convocation, lay out his needs, and ask for money.
So even a strong king had to negotiate, at least sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even if it was with the church leadership, it shows the leverage money provided.
And the struggle over the Magna Carta comes back again. culminating in the confirmation of the charters in 1297.
Yeah, this was basically forced on Edward I. He desperately needed money for his wars abroad, and his subjects used that leverage. Confirm our rights, and you get your funds. The sources note he wasn't happy about it, and later he secretly got the Pope to absolve him from the oaths he'd sworn to uphold the charter.
Wow. So what does it all mean?
The sources make it pretty clear. The fight for liberties, for legal rights in this era, it was completely tangled up with the king's bank balance and his need for parliament's support. Money talks, even then.
Okay, let's move to Edward II. The sources paint a picture of, well, rapid disappointment after his father's reign.
Yeah, there was initial hope, but it evaporated quickly. The sources talk about his want of capacity, at least of solid judgment, a lack of, basic competence. And this weakness just left the door wide open for favorites to dominate him.
Starting with Piers Gaveston.
Gaveston gained huge influence. The sources mention his lavish spending, even hinting he purloined some of that finery, suggesting possible misuse of funds. His arrogance, plus the king's obvious favoritism, naturally stirred up massive resentment among the powerful old nobility, especially Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, described as the wealthiest guy in England.
And this led to pushback.
Big time. The barons and clergy, backed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, demanded reforms. They called them the Ordinances. Lancaster was powerful enough to raise an actual army to force the issue.
Edward II's reign also saw military disasters, didn't it? Particularly against Robert Bruce.
Oh, yes. Bruce exploited the instability brilliantly, made successful raids deep into England. The sources say his army basically lived off plundering England, and he taught the Scots to despise the military genius of the English. Edward's own campaigns in Scotland just fizzled out.
And other problems were piling up, too.
Yeah, the kingdom was fraying. An Irish insurrection, a Welsh rebellion, constant feuding among nobles who were just exploiting the king's weakness for their own ends.
Gaveston wasn't the only controversial favorite. The Despensers came along later, father and son.
That's right. They rose to enormous power. The sources describe the younger Despenser as having, all the charm on the outside, but lacking moderation and prudence. His father is noted as being venerable from his age, but like Gaveston, their power and wealth quickly made them hated by the established aristocracy.
And their end, according to the sources, was pretty horrific.
Extremely brutal. The sources detail the elder Despenser being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The son hanged on a 50-foot gallows. Many of their supporters were executed or imprisoned too. Figures like Battlesmere and Gifford. Real bloodletting.
And other acts of violence, too, like the Earl of Arundel being executed without trial by Mortimer.
Yeah, it just speaks to the breakdown of any real legal process. Power struggles were raw, personal, and often deadly.
The sources also touch on the economy. Mentioning trade wasn't great.
Just a detail, yeah. Notes the generally low state of trade and manufacturing in England then, compared to Flanders, which was ahead in those areas. Gives a bit of context.
And for a slightly wider view, the source mentions the Knights Templar persecution happening elsewhere.
Under Philip IV of France, yes. The source mentions the ridiculous charges against them and basically blames Philip's greed and desire for revenge. It's a useful reminder, isn't it, that this era of political maneuvering, dubious justice, it wasn't just an English thing, it was happening across Europe. The source gives us that glimpse.
Okay, on to Edward III. His early reign was dominated by Mortimer and his mother, Queen Isabella, wasn't it?
Yes, Mortimer basically grabbed royal power, enriched himself, his allies, made peace with Scotland, recognizing their independence, actually, arranged the marriage between Edward's sister Jane and Robert Bruce's son David. But he was ruthless against rivals, seizing lands, prosecuting nobles.
But Edward III didn't stay under their thumb forever.
No, he eventually asserted himself. Started by telling judges to follow the law, ignore arbitrary orders from ministers. He also tackled the barons for protecting criminals. Crime had apparently soared during the instability of his father's reign.
And then came his huge claim, the French throne, kicking off the 100 Years' War.
Yeah, and the source is pretty scathing about that claim, calls it weaker or worse grounded. Argues French law precedent clearly ruled out inheriting through women. The source basically frames it as a pretext for violent conquest, driven more by ambition than solid legal right.
So what actually sparked the war? What were the immediate triggers?
Well, Philip VI of France had been protecting Robert Bruce. He'd also seized English lands in Gascony, and then a powerful exiled French noble, Robert of Artois, joined Edward and really pushed him to press his claim and go to war.
And Edward started building alliances on the continent.
He did, with Emperor Louis, the Duke of Brabant, various counts, people who could supply troops for his campaigns.
And crucially, he got Flanders on his side, largely through this figure, James d'Arteville.
Yeah, Flanders was vital, economically advanced arts, manufacturing. D'Urteville became this incredibly powerful, popular leader, basically controlling key cities like Ghent. The source actually comments that his rise was one of the first effects that Europe saw of popular violence after ages of kings and aristocrats dominating everything. He was key in swinging Flanders to England's side against France.
The war had some major early English victories, didn't it?
Oh, yes. The naval battle of Sluys was a huge French disaster. The source says 230 French ships taken, 30,000 French killed, minimal English losses. It even includes that anecdote about the fool telling the French king his sailors were brave for jumping into the sea. Later, Crécy and Poitiers on land, led by the Black Prince, were massive wins too.
And the source draws parallels between Crécy, Poitiers, and later Azincourt.
It does, highlights common factors. A certain boldness or temerity from the English leaders, often having smaller armies than the French, fighting from strong defensive spots, and crucially, the devastating impact of those English longbowmen.
But it wasn't all plain sailing for Edward III. Setbacks, truces, allies dropping out.
Definitely. Peace talks at Arras failed. Edward's demands were too high. The French king cleverly detached the emperor from Edward's side. Other allies drifted away. Edward ended up deep in debt, having to sneak out of Flanders to avoid his creditors at one point.
And Parliament back home seems to get more assertive during his long reign.
We definitely see that. Parliament demanding to see the accounts, even suggesting ministers for the king's council, though the source notes the king shut that down. There was a significant act passed, 15th Edward III, that would have given peers trial by their peers in Parliament and required royal appointments to high office get consent from barons and council. Big stuff.
Did it sick?
No. The source says Edward was later forced to repeal this statute. Shows the constant back and forth, but also Parliament flexing its muscles more.
Other conflicts popped up too, like in Brittany.
Yeah, a succession war there between Montfort and Charles of Blois. Edward backed Montfort. The source describes the siege of Vannes, highlighting how tricky it was supplying English troops just by sea from England. A truce, mediated by the Pope's guys, eventually paused that campaign.
The sources sometimes include these interesting little tactical details, don't they?
They do. There's the siege of Angoulême. Lord Norwich, the English commander, was in a tight spot, so he bluffed, marched his garrison out, baggage train, trumpets blaring, pretending it was a major move, fooled the besiegers completely, and saved his men. Clever stuff.
Edward seemed to really focus his ambition on Calais later on.
The source suggests he eventually narrowed his goal to conquering Calais, saw it as the key strategic foothold in France for the future. The siege was long. The governor, John of Vienne, put up a really brave defense. When surrender was inevitable, Edward initially demanded harsh punishment, wanting exemplary vengeance.
But Vienne argued against it.
He appealed for mercy, argued that brave men are entitled to better treatment, even comparing his knights favorably to the English. And then, of course, the famous story of Queen Philippa intervening to save the 6 citizens who offered their lives. The source also mentions a later plot by someone called Amory de Pavia to sell Calais back to the French, which Edward managed to stop.
Edward III also found time to campaign in Scotland again.
He did, yeah. After David Bruce briefly returned, Edward campaigned alongside Balliol, apparently devastating the land from Berwick up to Edinburgh. Balliol eventually resigned his claim entirely to Edward.
But Edward's later reign saw a decline. His health, the Black Prince's health, losses in France.
Yes, the Black Prince campaigned in Spain, supporting Peter of Castile, whom the source calls the ungrateful tyrant because he didn't pay the English troops as agreed. The climate there apparently ruined the prince's health. He came back to England, died before his father. With both key leaders declining or gone, England started losing ground again in France to Charles V. Edward III died the year after his son, leaving the throne to his young grandson, Richard II. A huge double loss for England.
Despite all Edward III's capacity and success, the source still paints the government as pretty basic, even primitive.
It describes it as, quote, at best was only a barbarous monarchy, not regulated by any fixed maxims. Quite a statement. One constant complaint Parliament had was about purveyance, calling it an outrageous and intolerable grievance.
Explain purveyance again.
It was the king's right to basically seize goods and supplies for the royal household at fixed prices, often paying with promises or IOUs called tallies. Despite laws trying to limit it, it kept happening because the king needed ready cash and supplies, and internal trade wasn't developed enough for him to just buy everything easily on the open market.
The sources mention Edward trying to boost the economy, though. Wool manufacturing.
Yeah, they note his efforts. Protecting foreign weavers who came over, banning imports of foreign cloth, also restricting exports of some manufactured goods like iron and finished cloth. Though the source muses maybe encouraging raw wool export would have been better. It even gives export figures for wool, sheepskins, leather, and cloth from 1354. Interesting snapshot.
So, even under a strong, capable king like Edward III, the fundamental struggles, Magna Carta, Parliament's rights, the king's financial needs, they just kept going.
Absolutely. Parliament kept pushing, kept demanding. Even if they didn't always win every battle, the dynamic was definitely shifting.
Which brings us to Richard II. A reign marked by instability and, ultimately, usurpation, according to the sources.
Yeah, it started with a minority, a governing council. And the sources note that even then, with a child king, the commons showed a strong spirit of freedom and awareness of their own authority.
And this was a time of wider social unrest across Europe.
Yes, the sources mention stirrings in Flanders, France, England. Early signs of art, better governance elsewhere, were making populations restless, dissatisfied with the old feudal ways.
Richard himself showed early promise, though. The sources praise him for something.
They do. During the Wat-Tyler Rebellion, when he was only 16, the source highlights his courage, his presence of mind, how he handled a really dangerous situation. Raise high hopes.
But those hopes didn't last.
No. The sources blame his decline on a want of capacity, at least of solid judgment. He became reliant on favorites again. Michael de la Pole is mentioned. The sources note de la Pole's merchant background, which the older nobility really resented, especially as he gained power.
And this led to conflict with his powerful uncles. Lancaster, York, Gloucester.
Big conflict. The barons imposed a parliamentary commission that basically took over royal power, backed by a group called the Appellants.
And Richard's ministers and allies paid the price.
A heavy price. Suffolk was impeached. Figures like Bremborough and Cressillion were executed. The sources note Bremborough's trial was incredibly summary, barely even the appearance of due process. Shows how violent and lawless these political fights were.
Even the uncles were squabbling amongst themselves.
Oh, yeah. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, married Catherine Swynford, who wasn't nobility. This really annoyed York and Gloucester, who felt it lowered the family's status. Gaunt managed to get Parliament to legitimize his children by her, but it definitely caused friction within the royal family.
Richard did have a period of stronger rule later on, though, around 1397.
He did, yeah. He moved to consolidate his power against the barons, seized London's charter temporarily, a real power move, though it was later returned. Parliament became totally subservient, passing whatever acts the king was pleased to dictate. They overturned all the actions of that earlier commission, declared it treasonous, reversed the punishments against his ministers. The sources mention he even reversed the attainder of the two dispensers from way back in Edward II's reign. It makes this amazing observation.
What's that?
That the ancient history of England is basically a catalog of reversals. One faction wins, overturns all the laws and judgments of the previous one. Then the tables turn again.
That's a really powerful lens to view this whole period through.
Isn't it? Highlights the sheer instability. The law wasn't fixed. It was a tool of the winner.
Okay, so this sets the stage for Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, son of John of Gaunt.
Right. Bolingbroke had a quarrel with the Duke of Norfolk. Richard used it as an excuse to banish both of them.
And then John of Gaunt died. What did Richard do?
He made a fatal mistake, a really provocative move. Using the authority of those parliamentary commissioners, even though he'd just canceled the commission itself, he revoked Bolingbroke's right to inherit his father's lands and seized the massive Lancaster estates. The sources stress this was seen as a direct attack on the property rights of all the nobility. If the king could do that to Lancaster, who was safe?
So Bolingbroke comes back to England.
His initial pretext was just to reclaim his inheritance, but support flooded towards him almost immediately. The sources say the principal nobility connected by blood, marriage, friendship joined him, seeing Richard's actions as a threat to themselves and the ordinary people. They found nothing in the king's person which they could love or revere. They were fed up, especially after the popular Duke of Gloucester's suspicious death. Loyalty shifted easily,
Leading straight to Richard's deposition, and Henry seizing the throne as Henry I.
Yeah, and Henry put forward several justifications, which the source says were insinuated, not avowed. basically hinted at rather than clearly argued because none were very strong. One was right of conquest weak, says the source, because he was a subject rebelling and only arrived with 60 men. Another was a dodgy hereditary claim through an ancestor, Edmund of Lancaster absurd, says the source, as Edmund was younger than the actual senior line.
So flimsy excuses.
Pretty much. The third claim was about saving the nation from tyranny, which the source notes is a good argument for being elected king, maybe, but not for just grabbing the crown based on hereditary right. These contradictory claims just show how shaky his legitimacy was.
How does the source reflect on Richard's fall itself?
It's quite insightful. Suggests it wasn't necessarily a grand plan for tyranny by Richard, but more down to his insolence of victory during that period of strong rule, plus the sheer pressures of his situation. It reflected the brutal manners of the age. It contrasts Richard's fate deposed, imprisoned, his favorites killed, with Edward III, who managed to regain power after making concessions, even though both kings had initially yielded authority. Interesting comparison.
So Henry IV is king, but on very shaky ground.
Extremely shaky. The sources say he thought superstitions a necessary implement of public authority. He deliberately played up to the clergy to get their backing, shore up his weak claim.
Which brings religious dissent into the political mix. The Lollards, John Wycliffe.
Right. Wycliffe had been protected by Henry's father, John of Gaunt. But his ideas challenged the church hierarchy, alarmed the clergy. Pope Gregory II had even issued a bull against him earlier. Now, under Henry IV, needing church support, we see the first actual laws passed against heresy. The source mentions the statute 2, Henry IV, chapter 7. And William Sawtrey is noted as the first Lollard martyr burned at the stake under this new law. It marks a darker turn. Religious persecution explicitly tied to political expediency.
Papal influence continued, too.
Oh, yes. The Pope could still shuffle bishops around, moving troublesome ones to poorer or just symbolic roles. The sources also mention other clerical devices for gaining wealth, manipulating bequests, using marriage laws to get property.
Did Henry IV face threats from outside England?
Initially, France was hostile because of Richard II's French wife, but France had its own internal chaos, so they ended up making truces. However, the Gascons, in English-held Guyenne down in France, they apparently remained loyal to Richard's memory, he was born there, and refused to accept Henry IV.
But the really big threats were internal rebellions.
Absolutely. The Percy family, Northumberland, his son Hotspur, his brother Worcester, huge figures in the north. Henry had given them top jobs, but they became discontented. Allied with the Welsh leader Owain Glyndwr, and the Scottish Earl of Douglas, though the sources mention Northumberland fell ill and couldn't join Hotspur for the key battle.
The Battle of Shrewsbury. That was crucial.
Very crucial. A major victory for Henry. Hotspur was killed. Worcester and others were captured and executed. The sources comment that Henry was kind of lucky these rebellions weren't better coordinated. They rose in rebellion one after another, which let him tackle them individually, like a later uprising by the Earl of Nottingham and the Archbishop of York.
Towards the end of his reign, Henry V starts getting involved in French internal politics.
Yes, the feuds between the Burgundians and Armagnacs. He starts playing sides, which really sets the stage for his son Henry V.
Right. Henry V, famous for his ambitions in France.
Yeah, Henry V saw a golden opportunity in France's intestine factions, that deep division between Armagnacs and Burgundians. He decided to renew the war and exploit it. The Duke of Burgundy, having been kicked out of Paris, actually sought an English alliance.
So Henry prepared for a major campaign.
Very thoroughly. Raised a new army, the sources give numbers, 24,000 archers and 4,000 horsemen, a significant force.
And then the battle everyone knows. Azincourt.
Another stunning English victory against the odds. The source again points out the similarities to Crécy and Poitiers. English outnumbered, strong defensive position, a devastating use of archers. English losses were incredibly low, according to the source, exceeded not 40, though it does add the caveat that some writers say it was more considerable. Still a fraction of the French losses.
And France itself was just falling apart at this point.
Total chaos. The queen's plotting, her treasurer seized, her favorite executed. It paints a picture of complete dysfunction that Henry V skillfully exploited. The Burgundy faction grabbed the French king. The Dauphin, the heir, had to flee.
The assassination of the Duke of Burgundy, that must have been a setback for Henry.
You'd think so, but actually no. It ended up uniting the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip, with the English against the Dauphin, who they blamed for the murder. The sources remark that this unlikely alliance, born from assassination, proved in the issue the most favorable event for Henry V's ambitions in France. Quite ironic.
leading to the Treaty of Troy. What did that entail?
A truly remarkable treaty. Henry V marries Catherine, the French princess, and he's declared regent and heir to the French throne, effectively disinheriting the Dauphin. Henry also had the advantage of having captured the young King James I of Scotland years earlier, which helped keep Scotland mostly quiet during his French campaigns.
But even Henry V faced some defeats. It wasn't all victories.
No, the source mentions the defeat and death of his brother, the Duke of Clarence, at the Battle of Gauget. Significantly, Scots fighting for the French were involved there. The source calls this the first action that turned the tide of success against the English, a crack in the image of invincibility.
And these campaigns, however successful, were massively expensive.
Incredibly costly. The sources give wage details. 6 pence a day for an archer, 2 shillings for a mounted man-at-arms. And the source makes a really crucial point. These most splendid successes proved commonly fruitless when supported by so poor a revenue. England simply couldn't afford these huge wars indefinitely. It states the debts and difficulties Henry ran up meant he paid dear for his victories, even Azincourt.
Do the sources estimate his income?
They put his total revenue at about £110,000 of our present money, which they note was worth much more back then due to cheaper prices, maybe above £330,000 in today's terms. Still, not enough for constant, large-scale warfare.
And Henry V died relatively young, didn't he? During a siege?
Yes, during the long siege of Meaux, died suddenly, leaving a baby son, Henry VI, guaranteeing a long minority government. And the sources note this power vacuum encouraged the English lords and the commons, too, to try and extend their own influence.
So how was the government set up for the infant king?
Interestingly, they avoided the title regent for England itself. Instead, Henry V's brother, the Duke of Bedford, was appointed protector or governor of the realm. Bedford is portrayed really positively in the sources. The most accomplished prince of his age, skilled at diplomacy, holding alliances together, commanding respect. He had renowned generals serving under him too: Somerset, Warwick, Salisbury, Talbot, Fastolf. A strong team initially.
Their main task, hold on to France, keep England stable.
Exactly. But problems cropped up pretty quickly, especially from Bedford's other brother, the Duke of Gloucester, Humphrey. The sources describe Gloucester as having vehement passions, being impetuous. His controversial marriage to Jacqueline of Hainaut really annoyed the Duke of Burgundy, who was Bedford's brother-in-law and England's vital ally. Bedford tried hard to smooth things over, but the damage to that key alliance was done.
And while Bedford was dealing with problems back in England, things started looking up for the French Dauphin, Charles VII.
They did. With Bedford away, Charles gained ground. Brittany, for instance, made a deal with him.
Which leads towards the Siege of Orleans, a major turning point.
Absolutely critical. The English under Salisbury had early success, but then Salisbury was killed by a cannonball. Bad luck, big impact. Suffolk took over command, invested the city. There was also this skirmish called the Battle of Herrings. Fastolf won a victory defending a supply convoy, apparently containing lots of fish for Lent.
And this is where Joan of Arc famously enters the story. How do the sources present her?
They give the narrative that circulated at the time, her claiming a divine mission, promising to raise the siege, get Charles crowned at Reims. Stories about her revealing a secret only the king knew, finding a hidden sword at St. Catherine of Fierbois. The sources are pretty direct that these stories were strategically spread to captivate the vulgar, to build morale, basically. They mention the church and parliament examined her and declared her mission undoubted and supernatural, but they also describe the conscious effort to shape her image.
Shape her image. How so?
They talk about creating this engine, as they call her, embellishing her background, changing servant to shepherdess to make it more romantic, adjusting her age to add to the mystique. It was propaganda, essentially, designed to inspire the French and terrify the English.
And did it work? What was her impact?
Immediate and dramatic. She arrives at Blois, enters Orleans. The sources say the English troops were simply overawed, totally impressed with the idea of a divine influence. Suffolk was apparently thrown into confusion. The siege was lifted.
Wow, and things kept going her way.
Rapid French successes followed. English positions around Orleans fell. Even the great Talbot hesitated to fight her directly. And Charles VII was crowned at Reims, exactly as Joan had promised. A huge symbolic victory.
How did the English react to all this?
Utter astonishment, mixed with fear. Their explanation wasn't divine intervention, but magic and sorcery and diabolical power. That's how they framed it. Cardinal Winchester even diverted troops he had raised for a crusade against heretics in Bohemia, sending them to Bedford in France specifically to counter Joan's influence.
But she was eventually captured.
Yes, during a sortie at Compiègne. captured by John of Luxembourg's forces, who then sold her to the English.
And her trial and execution. The sources are quite clear about how they view that.
Very clear. Tried by English-aligned bishops, burned alive for heresy and witchcraft. The sources describe the whole affair with detestation. What's fascinating, and the sources bring this out, is that clash of narratives. Divine messenger or diabolical witch. The English, seeing their French conquests crumble, used political and church power to destroy her. It shows how belief, propaganda, raw power just collided.
Even after Joan's death, the English decline in France continued.
Yes, it was a slow bleed. French commanders started raiding English territories again. Bedford himself suffered a setback, having to abandon the siege of Ligny.
And that crucial English-Burgundian alliance finally collapsed.
Completely. The death of Bedford's wife, Burgundy's sister, weakened the personal link. Then came the Congress of Arras, meant to broker peace. The sources say the English demands were seen as totally unreasonable, so they walked out. Charles VII and Philip of Burgundy then made their own peace deal. The sources analyzed Burgundy's motives. Uniting the English and French crowns under Henry VI wasn't actually good for his power. Plus, the Treaty of Troyes had ignored his own potential claim to the French throne. The new treaty freed Burgundy from being a vassal to the French king and gave him more territory. English anger was obvious, the source notes. When Burgundy sent a herald to England, he was deliberately lodged in a shoemaker's house as an insult.
So Burgundy turns on the English.
Openly attacks their possessions, even besieges Calais, though he pulls back before the English relief force arrives. Ultimately, it's downhill for the English. They lose Normandy, then Guyenne. The sources blame growing French strength, but also English weakness, lack of money and supplies. Somerset, cornered in Rouen, was forced to surrender by the city's own inhabitants turning against the English.
Which brings the focus back squarely on England and the eruption of a new, even more devastating conflict. The Wars of the Roses.
Yes, the culmination of decades of simmering resentment, factionalism, all rooted in that disputed succession back when Henry IV took the throne.
So, what were the arguments for each side according to the sources? The Lancastrians, supporting Henry VI.
Their case rested on Henry I's claim being based on general consent, a national act. The idea that the people, freed from Richard II's tyranny, had voluntarily accepted Henry IV and felt gratitude towards him. They also stressed the oaths of loyalty sworn by the nobility to Henry IV V and the VI. Breaking those oaths was a big deal.
And the Yorkist argument, for Richard, Duke of York.
Pure hereditary right. They traced his lineage back to Lionel, Duke of Clarence, Edward III's second surviving son. John of Gaunt, Henry I's father, was the third son. So the Yorkist line was genealogically senior. They argued Henry IV was a plain usurper, Henry VI a violent possessor. The Lancastrian line, they claimed, had no original title beyond force and shaky consent.
How is Richard, Duke of York, portrayed in the sources?
Quite positively, actually. As a man of valor and abilities, prudent, mild-mannered, someone who preferred using time and policy rather than just jumping into violence. He had experience governing in France. But the sources note he was recalled from that command thanks to the plotting of his rival, Somerset, which definitely fueled his resentment.
A key event that poisoned the atmosphere was the death of the Duke of Gloucester. Humphrey again.
Yes, the sources call him the virtuous Duke. His death, widely suspected to be murder orchestrated by the Lancastrian faction around the Queen, was hugely damaging. He'd been popular. His death lost the Lancastrian support and gained them infamy. A double blow, as the source puts it.
And the Duke of Suffolk is implicated in that.
Seen as having an active hand in Gloucester's death, Suffolk became incredibly unpopular as the Queen's favorite and prime minister. His merchant background was resented by the old nobility. He faced accusations of selling secrets, giving up French land, eventually impeached, banished, and then murdered at sea. A sign of the times.
And the Duke of Somerset took his place.
Yes, succeeded Suffolk in power and the Queen's favor, but inherited all the public hatred. Made worse because the final loss of France happened on his watch. He became the focus of Yorkist anger.
There was other unrest too, like Jack Cade's rebellion. Any connection to the main conflict?
The sources suggest Yorkist sympathies were involved. Cade's demands were typical: get rid of bad ministers, punish corruption, address grievances. His followers briefly seized London, executed Lord Say without trial. But Cade couldn't control them, they started looting, the citizens fought back, and Cade was killed. The source points out the demands reflected genuine public anger about corrupt favorites getting rich while the country suffered.
All this political tension finally boils over into actual fighting. First Battle of St. Albans, 1455.
Exactly. York marches towards London, meets the king's army, demands Somerset be removed and tried. There's a bit of theater. Somerset is briefly put under arrest as a pretense, but the king releases him. Then the battle starts. The king is wounded, Somerset is killed, others too. The sources make a key point here. Personal resentments, a point of honor, meant families became implacable enemies after this. It got personal very quickly.
And Queen Margaret steps up as a major player for the Lancastrians.
Very much so. The sources credit her with vigor and spirit, contrasting her determination with York's more irresolute temper. She becomes the driving force rallying the Lancastrian cause, especially in the north, described as the most warlike region. The sources mention she appealed to them by promising spoils from raiding the richer south, raising a big army, 20,000 strong.
But this led to some devastating battles for the Yorkists initially.
Yes, the Battle of Wakefield was a disaster. Richard of York himself was defeated and killed, reportedly quite brutally by Lord Clifford. The sources briefly mention the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, suffering a setback at Ferrybridge and dramatically stabbing his own horse, swearing to fight on foot with his men. Classic Warwick gesture. But then came the absolutely decisive Battle of Towton in 1461, a massive, bloody victory for York's son, Edward, Earl of March. This effectively made him King Edward IV, forcing Margaret and the young Henry VI to flee.
So Edward I, the Yorkist king, takes the throne. Sources mention his strengths, but also a key weakness.
Yeah, he had the valor, the ability, but also an amorous temper, which led him into a politically disastrous decision.
His secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville.
Exactly. Hugely controversial. She was, according to the source, daughter of a private gentleman, Sir Richard Woodville, though her mother was the Duchess of Bedford from a second marriage. Despite her beauty and qualities, marrying her secretly and her relatively low status compared to foreign princesses was seen as a huge mistake by many nobles. And crucially, it mortally offended the most powerful man in the kingdom, the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker.
Why was Warwick so furious? What was the issue?
Warwick was right in the middle of negotiating a prestigious marriage for Edward, with Bona of Savoy, sister of the French queen. To find out the king had secretly married someone else, making his high-profile diplomatic mission totally pointless, was a massive public and personal insult. Warwick felt utterly humiliated.
And Warwick had the power to make his anger felt.
Immense power, vast estates, huge numbers of retainers. The sources mentioned 20,000. His Neville family connections, his popularity. He wasn't someone you wanted as an enemy.
His discontent led him to plot with Edward's own brother.
Yes, George, Duke of Clarence, who then married Warwick's daughter Isabel. Warwick's ambition then radically shifted. He decided to restore the House of Lancaster. He even allied with his bitter enemy, Queen Margaret, and her son, Prince Edward, despite the fact Margaret had executed his father and he'd imprisoned Henry VI. Shows how much he hated Edward V by this point. Though the sources note webs of betrayal, Clarence apparently secretly promised Edward he'd ditch Warwick later. And Warwick's own brother, Montague, was also playing a double game against Edward. Very messy.
Warwick actually succeeded, briefly, in restoring Henry VI.
Astonishingly, yes. He raised forces incredibly quickly. Edward V was caught off guard, forced to flee to Holland. The source notes Edward escaped so fast he took hardly anything valuable except a fancy sable-lined robe he gave the ship's captain as payment. So Henry VI, frail and bewildered, was put back on the throne. Warwick and Clarence ran the government in his name. Margaret prepared to return from France.
But Edward V wasn't finished.
Not at all. He came back. And Clarence promptly deserted Warwick, bringing 12,000 men over to Edward's side as apparently planned. This led to the Battle of Barnet. Warwick was defeated and killed. The sources mention a bizarre accident that helped the Yorkists.
What was that?
Apparently, in the fog of battle, Edward's badge, a sun, was mistaken by some Lancastrians for the Earl of Oxford's badge, a star with streams. They thought Oxford had betrayed them and started attacking their own side. Caused chaos.
Wow, and shortly after Barnet.
The Battle of Tewkesbury, Queen Margaret, who had just landed, was decisively defeated. Her son, Prince Edward, the Lancastrian heir, was killed after the battle. Margaret herself was captured.
And the fate of poor Henry VI.
He died in the Tower shortly after Tewkesbury, widely believed to have been murdered on Edward I's orders. Other Lancastrian resistance was crushed. Peace, of a sort, was restored. Parliament dutifully ratified Edward's acts, as victors usually arranged.
Edward V's later reign was more settled, focused on other things.
Yeah, more settled. Focused on shoring up his finances, acquiring wealth. He used methods like benevolences.
Forced gifts, basically.
Pretty much. The sources say they were pretended to be voluntary, but could not be deemed entirely voluntary. Parliament granted him money too, but sometimes attached conditions, showing they hadn't totally given up asserting themselves.
What about foreign policy? More war with France?
He planned one, allied with the Duke of Burgundy again, invaded France. But Burgundy didn't show up with the expected support, so Edward ended up making peace with Louis XI of France, the Treaty of Picquigny. The sources are quite critical of it, say it did very little honor to either, showing Edward's imprudence and Louis's little regard to the point of honor. A key part of the deal was Louis paying pensions, basically bribes, to Edward and several influential English nobles.
What happened to Queen Margaret?
She was eventually ransomed by Louis XI and returned to France, where she died. The source's final description of her is incredibly harsh. Says she had neither the virtues nor the weaknesses of her sex, but was tainted with the ferocity and endowed with the courage of that barbarous age. Oof.
Yeah, quite damning. Edward the Fool took other measures too, financial ones.
Yes, tried to improve royal revenue, but the sources say some methods were oppressive, though the details are unknown to us today.
And then there's the incident the source calls an act of tyranny against his own brother Clarence.
Yeah, Clarence, who'd already betrayed Warwick for Edward. He later fell out with Edward again, opposed the condemnation of some of his friends. Edward had him arrested, thrown in the Tower. Parliament accused him of treason, attainered him. Then he was privately executed. Famously, the rumor mentioned in the source is that he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Whether true or not, it's stuck. The sources draw that grim parallel to the fate of Duke Humphrey of Gloucester earlier, brother against brother.
Edward was planning another war when he died.
Preparing for another French campaign, yes, but died unexpectedly. His big worry, apparently, was the faction fighting that would erupt during his young son's minority. He tried to reconcile the key players on his deathbed. Didn't work.
Which leads us straight into the final dramatic chapter of this period, Richard III's usurpation and fall.
Richard, Edward the False's surviving brother, acted fast after Edward's death, showering rewards, trying to gain favor.
But his claim to the throne itself was problematic, to say the least.
Incredibly weak. It rested entirely on declaring Edward the False's children illegitimate, using what the source calls disgraceful pretenses to try and win over the populace. The source absolutely condemns it, says every principle of honor and humanity was renounced. Strong words.
And the most notorious act associated with him, the fate of the young princes in the Tower.
Yes. The sources cite Sir Thomas More's account of Edward V and his younger brother being suffocated while they slept. The source expresses utter horror at this violation of private and domestic duty. It also notes that when Henry VII later searched for the bodies, they were supposed to be already removed. The mystery added to the infamy.
Plots against Richard started almost immediately, centering on Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond.
That's right.
So remind us, who was Henry Tudor? What was his claim exactly?
He was the son of Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort. Now, Margaret Beaufort was crucial. She was a granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. The sources state that her lineage provided the only color of hereditary right for Henry's claim. It was a pretty distant Lancastrian connection through a female line that had previously been barred from succession, but it was something.
And a clever political move was proposed to strengthen his claim.
Absolutely crucial. A marriage alliance between Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York, Edward I's eldest daughter. This masterstroke would unite the rival Lancastrian and Yorkist claims, offering the promise of ending the decades of civil war. A very appealing prospect to many.
There was an early rebellion against Richard, led by the Duke of Buckingham.
Yes, Buckingham, who had initially supported Richard, turned against him, encouraged by Henry Tudor's mother, Margaret Beaufort. But the rebellion failed. Bad weather, lack of coordination. Buckingham was captured and executed. Richard survived the first major challenge.
So Richard tries to consolidate his power.
Desperately. Tried securing foreign alliances. Even bizarre rumors circulated that he wanted to marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York, the woman intended for Henry Tudor. The sources claim that Elizabeth's mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, initially, bizarrely, agreed to this very unusual and incestuous potential match with her son's suspected murderer. Apparently hoping to regain power, she rode against Richmond, though later she backed off and took sanctuary again. Very strange situation.
Meanwhile, Henry Tudor is preparing his invasion from France.
Yes, with support from the French king, though not a huge army. The Earl of Oxford, a staunch Lancastrian who'd escaped imprisonment, joined him, bringing vital intelligence about the mood in England, the dislike for Richard,
leading to Henry's landing.
He landed at Milford Haven, in Wales, strategically chosen for its historical connections, with a pretty small force initially, about 2,000 men. But as he marched inland, support began to snowball. Welsh support was significant early on.
It all comes down to the Battle of Bosworth Field, 1485.
The decisive moment. Richard III was defeated and killed in the thick of the fighting, reportedly defending himself to the last extremity. An absolutely key factor was the betrayal by Lord Stanley, Henry Tudor's stepfather. Stanley commanded a large contingent, supposedly loyal to Richard. But he held back, waited until he saw which way the battle was turning, then declared for Henry. That swung it decisively.
What were the losses?
Significant on Richard's side, about 4,000 killed, including key supporters like the Duke of Norfolk. The victors' losses were low. Sir William Catesby, called a great instrument of Richard's crimes, was executed afterwards. Richard's body was found stripped on the battlefield, a brutal end, marking the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, the end of the Wars of the Roses, and the beginning of the Tudor era.
Wow. What a journey. That takes us through centuries of just incredible conflict and change.
It really does. From Henry III wrestling with barons, popes, and his own finances, to the Edwards, ambitious, warlike, shaping parliament and law, but also pushing boundaries, Richard II's turbulent reign and downfall, then the Lancastrians desperately trying to hold on to that contested crown, the sheer devastation of the Wars of the Roses, driven by claims, feuds, betrayals, right up to Richard III's dramatic rise and fall at Bosworth. It's exhausting just recounting it.
And the sources, as we've unpacked them, really show how, amidst all that chaos, all that struggle, these fundamental ideas about law, about Parliament's role, about who actually held legitimate power, they were being hammered out. Slowly, painfully. It wasn't some neat blueprint. It was messy, reactive, shaped by crisis, by personality, by sheer necessity. This deep dive wasn't just a timeline of kings. It was about seeing the roots of English governance forming in really difficult soil, right there in these accounts.
Agreed. The sources give you that ground-level view, the complexities, the contradictions.
And they leave you with, I think, a really powerful impression. They document an age where, yeah, legal claims mattered, precedents mattered, but so often, personal character, a king's flaw, a favorite's greed, a queen's grit, a noble's ambition, a sudden betrayal, combined with just sheer chance, unpredictable moments. It could completely overturn everything. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Looking back, how much of history is truly driven by those big underlying forces in economics, constitutional shifts, and how much is actually shaped by the volatile personalities, the unexpected twists, the almost accidental moments that these contemporary sources bring to life so vividly? Definitely something to think about. That was our deep dive for today.